Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir. I'm your host, Justin Schwarzenberger, and on today's episode, we are going to be covering dependency injection, talking a little bit more about that subject and how it plays out in Angular. Should be pretty cool. Let's get after it. Say hi to our panelists, see who we got here today. We got Austin McDaniel with us. Austin, how's it going?
How's it going, everyone? I'm excited for today's topic.
Yes, very much. We got Mike Brocky with us. Mike, what's going on?
Not too much. Ready to talk a little bit, mumble about dependency injection.
Nice. You'll warm up. I think you'll get it going here as we.
I think that may have been an opaque token.
All right, here we go. The jokes are coming already, right? All right, maybe we'll have some puns and stuff too. It should be pretty cool. All right, our guest today is Jecelyn Yeen. Jecelyn, how's it going?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jecelyn.
It's great to have you on. Looking forward to talking some dependency injection. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, what you got going on and stuff, so they can meet and greet you.
Right. So my name is Jecelyn. I'm working in Malaysia. So the time zone is about 12-hour difference from US. And I'm working as the software architect front end in a company called Randstad. So it's a HR company, so they do a lot of HR consultings and all those things. So we have a lot of small to medium Angular applications used by our clients and within our company. Yeah.
Nice. Is Angular? You got any AngularJS ones? Primarily Angular?
Yes, we have AngularJS one. Indeed, we tried out Vue.js for one of the small project, and then for some reason we switched back to Angular, and because the team still like Angular, especially the dependency injection that other framework doesn't have. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, and so dependency injection, something you're pretty excited about? Is that correct?
Yes.
Nice.
So if you have a team that's excited about dependency injection, what was their technical background? Because some frameworks and some languages have dependency injection flavors and implementations, but not all of them. So I was just curious what other technologies people use that we're familiar with.
Yeah, so my team, so most of my team working with Angular 1 application before, and also from C# background. Some are from Java background, so it's pretty much, so you know that because in Java and C# there's dependency injections, and the team use a lot, and it's actually also easier for unit testing, so they're used to that pattern. So when we move on to do Angular application, the dependency injection then just become a natural.
That makes a whole lot of sense. When I hear that people are excited about dependency injection in Angular, their background is typically either Java or C#. So it doesn't surprise me to hear both of those mentioned.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Node or like JavaScript has like a service locator pattern. And so like that's why you're typically going to hear like the folks that do JavaScript not get excited about dependency injection, because they're like kind of like, why do I need it? Because, you know, JavaScript modules have this like service locator. But like one of the reasons, like when you start trying to do like inversion of control and things like that, like the service locator pattern is like terrible because you've got to like rewire a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. And also one of the things is this provide a dependency injection, and the Angular services provide a consistent way. So wherever you want to do something, you know that this thing should do in component or this thing to do in service. So it's pretty much the mental model pretty much set. So you should go here or there. So yeah, it's easier for the team.
Yeah, I kind of find it interesting with the whole dependency injection thing that we have in Angular, right? It's like so embedded in it. It's a core part of the whole platform, right? And so people that come into it and start working with it, maybe if they don't have a background in dependency injection, they just kind of adopt it and start doing it. I wonder if maybe we can talk briefly about why dependency injection can be such a valuable thing. And Austin, you mentioned inversion and control and things like that. Maybe we can touch a little bit about what the power of dependency injection provides us as a pattern, right?
Yeah. So I think one of the things is, for example, the framework actually provides some basic services, and then we can just use out of the box. And when we need a new service, what we need to do is, it's not like we can just create another service, implement the same class, and then we inject it into the module. Then it's just work. I think this is one of the benefit, because the implementations and the not the implementation, the way that we are using it is very simple, and it's a little bit of like magic. So you just provide a service and then inject it to the other, then you can just use it like how you use it, the default class. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's like that. And then that power of that inversion of control, right, is that thought of saying, okay, I'm going to hand things to this piece of code that it needs to work with. And like you mentioned, now because of that, you have this ability to swap those things out and then provide something different. And I think, maybe the first thing that people think of is, well, for testing purposes, right? It makes that easier for that. But also at runtime and things like that, I would imagine as well.
You also have like I briefly touched on just like a few minutes ago, like without that dependency injection, I don't know if you've ever tried to write like complicated unit tests in JavaScript without dependency injection, right? There's all these like NPM packages called rewire. And basically what they do is they just like swap all your paths out at runtime. And like, it's so hacky. It's so hacky. And so with that like inversion of control that you have, right? Like, you don't have to do any of that. Like, you can just let DI kind of handle that itself.
Yeah, the differences between those is very much conceptually the idea of push and pull, where requires are all right. I want to pull stuff in. I want to pull stuff in. And dependency injection is about pushing it in, and you have to do it with hand motions. I mean, you can't really explain it without hand motions. But yeah, so with rewire and what have you, is that you're basically saying, hey, when I pull this in, it's like, no, I'll handle that, and I'll tell you where you're actually going to get that from. But dependency injection gives you that control externally to say, hey, I'm going to push in the values whenever you instantiate a class that you're providing the values that you want.
Another thing that like Angular's dependency injection library is like really awesome. Like, I've been working on a state management library, and we have this like plugin ability, and we basically like use dependency injection to like handle all the like loading of the plugins and swapping them out and things like that. So it's almost like a plugin API as well.
Yeah. Jecelyn, how do you find it in comparison to thinking about like dependency injection, say C# or Java? How is the pattern a little bit different, and is there, what's that kind of feel like?
Okay. Initially, some of my some of the backend developer that I work with, when they can't jump into Angular, they thought that the dependency injection would be the same as in C#, but actually it's a little bit different. So for example, when we inject a class, when we inject a dependency injection, normally the example we see is we just in the provider, then we put in the service, and then in each of the component, we import the service again, and then we inject it into the constructor. And this actually pose a few confusion, like why do I need to import the service again in the module and import the service again in the component? Because when you say dependency injection, supposedly I don't need to import the class again. I should have an interface that implement that. I just inject when I do the injections in the component, I should just import the interface. So that caused a little bit of confusion. But in that case, this serves as the concrete implementations, and so in the module it serves as the concrete implementation that you inject in, and in the component it actually serves as an interface so that you can sort of strong type that. So this is one of the confusion that I see.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if like you sat there and said, okay, you need to learn dependency injection to kind of work with Angular, right? And you don't know dependency injection, where do you start? Like, do you tell somebody to go learn dependency injection in these other type of languages? And then is there going to be that challenge of, well, it's kind of like dependency injection, but there's some things that are different. I've done dependency injection with C#, not too much in other languages. I wonder if, like with C# and Java and things like that, is it more like one way, and then we've got this way in Angular that you just described being something completely different from those?
It's not, for me, it's not like completely different, but there's some slight difference, like because in the you still in the Angular dependency injection, there's of course in C# you also have many ways to do it. Some people from Angular 1 background will think that dependency injections is always a singleton, because you wherever in Angular 1, when you do dependency injections, it's always just one instance created throughout the whole application. But in the new Angular, there is like you can use by using the service, you can do application level injections, or you can inject the service by the module, and you can inject the service in the component. You can define your service in the component. So there are multi-level of injections on that. And so when people start, so I would suggest that just start with the module level, and then application level, then the component level when you need it.
I think one of the big differences between like dependency injection, and I've actually ran into this, dependency injection in like languages like C# and Java, is the DI in those languages, they're transient, meaning like when it requests one, like it creates a new one every time, versus like in Angular where they're not, right? Like they're state, right? And that's just the difference between working with dependency injection for like a server where there is no state really, and dependency injection for like a web app where it's stateful.
Yeah, but when you mentioned that about other languages and doing dependency injection, there's usually configuration that will determine how often or based off of what rules a new class would be generated. Not where for how you want to handle state or reuse or what have you. They give you those types of customizations as you define your container of how you want those to be spawned off or created for you.
Yeah, but for the server, like from what I've seen, like typically everything is transient. If you want it to be the reverse, which is what Angular does, like stateful like that, you have to like specifically say that.
Correct. And
Correct.
for most of the DI frameworks I've used when I was working with other languages, dating myself, but a few years ago.
VB.
I'd rather not talk about it.
Right.
So you have this concept, right, where you kind of have to like register these, right, services with the provider, and we do that at our ng modules, right? How would you go about, what do we need to think about in terms of organizing that, and where do we do that with our services? You mentioned starting out with just one module and doing it there, right? But as our our applications get complex and we have different ng modules and things like that, like how do we kind of make sense of keeping track of that?
Yeah, so we have a lot of discussion within the team, like where should we put our service? Should we put in the app level? Should we put in the module level? And should we create a folder, or it should be somewhere else? And then because like for example, like some of the service is just between components. So it's like interaction between components. So we need to create a service for that. Where should we place that? And for us, for the application level service, we will have a service folder for that. And for each of the module, if the service is within the module, then we will create, we will have a service folder in each of the module as well. And then for the component, for the service between components, so depends. So that case is very much depending. So for example, if the service is within the parent component, we will have component.service in the component folder. Things like that. This is how we currently organize that. One of the downside for this is you might see some service in here, you might see some service in there. So there's not a single folder that put in all the service. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I think like for me, it's thinking about kind of a little bit of domain-driven design and where do those fit in their own domain together, right? And grouping them that way. And then trying to think about at what point do I register those in the provider of the module, and is that module lazy loaded or not? So am I going to get one instance for my entire app, or am I going to get one instance per lazy load? You know, those sort of things. But I think that that's one of the little bit challenges. I mean, it's something we face as architecting applications that I think is just part of it, right? I mean, there's always going to be these challenges of thinking about where do you put things and organize things and how do you bring them all together. But it's certainly one that arises and sometimes can get challenging with figuring out like, okay, if I register, you know, I think one thing is that when you register this service and provider in a module, and you have some other module that consumes it, and then you decide to move that module somewhere else, right? Like you can get this flow down of, oh, this service is available because I happen to register it in a module that's brought in somewhere else. But as soon as I kind of break that apart, it becomes, you know, not available anymore. And so I don't know, how do you keep track of thinking about, I have a component down here that's using a service and it came from 3 modules over, and not really, you know, get yourself into a coupling there? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jecelyn. I'll let you.
No, you go first.
Okay. I've worked with 2 different types of teams, or 2 different thought processes there about where do you inject your services. One of them is like, I don't want to deal with it. I'm just going to put everything at the root. And this way, if I need it anywhere in my application, it's provided, it's there. I have a single instance and that's about it. I don't want to think about it. Just simple, and I'll load them all up front. Which is fine. That works for some teams, depending upon the app and how many services and what have you. The other school of thought that I've come across is the idea of, I'm going to just provide it as close to its only need as possible at the most specific common root that I could possibly have. So whether or not that's all the way down to the specific level of a specific module, I've seen people who have said, I only need this service for a component and provide it just on the component. And every time I get an instance of the component, I put it in there. Maybe you have state or whatever, you just separating out some logic. But usually it's the closest module is what I've seen and what people seem to gravitate towards. But as Justin pointed out, as modules move around and you need different functionality in different locations within your application, you reach the challenges of saying, all right, I want to take this and I want to move this to a more general level, but do I want to leave this service provided here? Do I want to move it up? Do I need that functionality? And you have to rethink that every time you do a refactor. Not just, hey, I want to move a module, but what is inside that module as well.
Yeah, that happens very much in some of my projects as well. So we just move, and then we just move that around. And then there's also times where the service actually just missing because of the moving. I don't find like solution for that, so we just need to deal with it. And the migrations, wherever you move that, just need someone that knows the project, because my project normally is not that big enough, so the team have the knowledge on how we structure the thing, so then the moving is smoother.
Cool. Yeah. One of the things I think I found that helps in that is the unit testing, right? And we write these specs, and if we write these specs and start thinking about if I'm testing a component and the services that it's getting injected in it, and I'm only providing those things for my spec, my test run, then it kind of can expose if there's other dependencies of the tree that thing is relying upon that I don't have because I didn't bring them into my test module, right? So I don't know, is that something that could also maybe help with that organization, I think?
Okay, so that might help. But there's also time where so for some of the project, we'll just have the setup of injecting like most of the services in. So this is something that we do, like some hack, because we want to set up the testing module a little bit fast. So we'll have an array of service that always will injecting into the unit test, although this is not that right. So sometimes, like when we move the module to somewhere, then the service is still there then, but it's missing. So wherever we compile our code or the unit test is not running, then we know that it's broken somewhere.
Unit tests will set you free. They give you the freedom and the confidence to be able to do different refactors and everything else. I can't advocate testing more than that. They just allow you to say, all right, I want to do a refactor, I want to make some changes, but did it break anything else? If I move this, is it going to break? And they just give you that reassurance of saying, hey, yeah, I covered my bases. I'm happy. So, and that's not just DI, that's just testing in general, but DI certainly helps with organizing testing.
No.
So I think one of the things we're familiar with in Angular is using the provider's property, right, in the decorator and providing our services through there. But there's also those other ways that we can register providers, right, and use class, use value, stuff like that. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, I think the way that we can inject the things into the to do dependency injection in Angular is really good, because we can inject pretty much anything. So you can inject by using a value. So for example, you probably have a class, or you probably have just an object which store all the API string. So for example, you have an API for customer, you have a constant that store all this string, and you can, if you don't want to like import this class, this object into a specific service or specific component, you can create a service for that. And how you do it, you just need to provide you can create an injection token, and then you just provide it as a value to create a service for that. And it's really helpful because it can be an object, it can be just a string, or it can be just a list of array, whichever thing that you think that you want to decouple. You just create that and then inject that in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that that's something that, if we think about in terms of inversion of control as we write our code, right? These are the sort of things that get exciting in terms of the way that we architect our code, because we have this ability, like you mentioned, to say, well, I need this config value. How can I get it into these pieces of code throughout my application? Do I just provide it globally and bring it in as a constant or something like that? Well, you leverage this whole dependency injection pattern that we have and do the value like you mentioned. Now it's really easy to consume that, but as well, we can test that, right? And we can mock that out really easily and get pretty far with that as well. So those are big benefits.
Yeah. And I think prior to Angular version 4 or version 3, we have something called an opaque token. So when we use the opaque token, we cannot like specify the type, because there's no you cannot specify like what are the interface or what are the type of the token. But with the new Angular 4 and 5 onwards, I think, then you can use something called injection token, which you can specify a type, like probably an interface or for what is the token, the shape of the token would be. And it's make things easier. So you can you can do the similar way where how you inject in C# or Java, which you can provide the token with that interface, and then you can have a class that implement the specific interface, and then you just use the class for that injection, like in inversion control.
And so then what would be the difference between the injection token and, say, using add injectable on a class or service that we write?
Okay, so if it's a class, then you can just do like how we normally do the dependency injection, just include the service in. But if it's in some different shape, or if you want to be more loosely coupled, like from the syntax look like, so you can just provide some interface and then just inject that in. So that's one of the difference if you are doing the class. And for some others value like object and arrays, all these, then injection token can be the ways of doing that, because you can't just import a class, import an object and then just inject that into the just register that as a dependency injection. Yeah.
And then so on the other side, on the consumption of these and taking these into our constructors, whether it be in a component or in another class or service or whatnot, we've got some decorators that we can use, right? Things like, we see things like self and skip self and optional host. Can we talk a little bit about those?
Yeah. Do you guys use like some of the one of the question I have, like, is that is that a lot of time where you use like a self, a skip self, optional and host decorator for your injection?
I have before in tricky cases.
Okay, so yeah, most of the time we also don't use that, only like in specific case. For example, we have an optional decorator, which if the which means that if the DI we have injected DI, then we can use that. We have registered that we can use that. But if we don't have, then you just don't need to inject that, because if we don't register that and we use that, normally Angular will throw us an error. But in some of the optional case, you might just want to just put an alias optional decorator, then the your application can compile, can run it. Just that probably sometimes it's not really injected because you don't need that. Yeah.
Could that be used in the case where you have a like, let's say, a component inside of a module that's lower down and you don't know whether or not the service is going to be available from another module higher up or something, and so you do that optional for that case? Or what would be maybe use cases for that?
One of the use case probably is logger. So if you don't, so for the particular components, you can either log or don't log. If there's no logger, then you just don't log any value. So that makes sense that you use optional, because it can be, you just in some case you just don't need that.
Cool. And then like the skip and skip self, or the self and skip self. Austin, you mentioned you've used that a little bit. Do you have an example of maybe when you've used that?
Yeah, in my state management library. Basically, like for feature modules, right, you have like a anchored module at the top, like a root module, and then in your feature modules, you need to actually like reference the root module. So what you do is you use skip self, and then it knows how to walk the tree up. It starts at the root. It doesn't walk upwards. It starts at the root and just grabs that one.
Do you think that these are things that get pretty complicated in our lives as Angular developers, and maybe it's we get a lot of win from this DI, but maybe there's also some pain points that we hit? What do you think?
I think that like that is an extremely useful feature. I had no idea how I was going to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish, and like I realized that, I figured this out, that there's actually this feature in there. I think the majority of people won't even ever use this or need to know what it is. But when you're getting into really tricky cases, like I give the Angular team like a ton of credit for the maturity that this DI system has. Just things like foregraph, right? Like thinking about like the foregraph, the skip self, optional, like all those things. They're really tricky scenarios that you have to really think through, and they can be really powerful once you know how to use them.
Yeah. And it's like giving you extra power that you can use, but not necessarily that you need to use every time. And most of the case, the basic service, the basic dependency injection already cover that all. So when people say that it's so complicated to learn, it's like it's about how much you want to learn. Like all this extra superpower, probably you just don't need it when you develop a simple application. But when you need it, it's really handful.
Yeah, that's a great point. So what about like this whole concept of setting up and initializing our services, right? I mean, because this is the cool thing about it. Like both of you mentioned, is that there's so much more power. That there's all these things that we can do now, right? And have this access to an ability to do and architecture to solve. So if we had a case like a service that needed to take in some configuration or setup, we can kind of do that with the provide and factories and stuff like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So one of the thing, one of the pretty confusing point when we create a shared module is when I think the first time when we create a shared module, because in the shared module we also have some service, so and some component inside the shared module. So we learned that wherever we want some others the external module to reference to this module component, we need to import that into the export. In the ng module, there's an export property that we can put in. But for service, there's no way to do. There's like, you need to inject that again in the app module, or you need to do in somewhere, which at the very beginning, the teams actually, the team include like all of us, like don't know why is that there's no export service, but there's export components. So it's caused a little bit confusion on that part. And then after that, we how we do is we try to search for others Angular project. So we see that some of the project actually have .forroot or .initialize applications when they define the module. Then we sort of look into these public libraries, like some of the famous like Angular Fire 2, and we know that actually you cannot export service per se, because service is not for exporting, but you can create a factory to inject the service in, and when you define the module, it just come together with the module. That's why sometimes you have for root, sometimes you have for features with excluding some of the service. So yeah.
And so then that really provides us this opportunity, right, to say, I want to set up my service, but it has a dependency on something else that I need to bring in. And so I can kind of do that configuration at that module level, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of tools. And like Austin said, the stuff that's provided by the Angular team for us to pull this stuff off is pretty powerful.
You can actually, there's a project out there called injectionjs, and it's basically like the core pieces of the Angular DI system, but extracted into like its own project. And I've actually used the Angular DI in a Node project, and it works really well.
Oh, nice. I saw that is the I think it's created by Minco. So yeah, it's like it's extract out the injection piece of the powerful piece of Angular, and then you can use that in others project like React and some other project that you want. And yeah.
So what about multi-providers? and maybe we can talk a little bit about that and maybe use cases for that, or what we're talking about with those.
Okay, so probably I can share my screen on. Let me. Do you see my screen?
Yep. Yep.
All right. So one of the use case that we use multi-providers. Okay, so multi-provider is like you can provide the same token with a multiple implementations. Let me just show. Okay. So in this particular demo, I'm using injection token. So I have a token which implement this interface called chat processor, which have an ID and have a function called process data. And I create an injection token for that. So what I do is in the application module, what I have is I would just implement provide. This is how I register my my service in. So I have a chat processor, I provide that, and I say use class. So in this case, normally we just have one class that implement one of the interface, but in this case, because in the UI, what I want to show is I want to show two charts of that, and the implementation might be different. So what I do is I just provide the same kind of token, and then I just put another additional property called multi-true, so that it will have multiple providers that implement this same class. Then what I'll do is I have two implementations. One is called processor air, so which is the chart air, the logic to process the chart air. So what I'll do is in the process data, I have my a bunch of logic that I've written, and then in the processor X, which is the chart number 2, I will have the same process data functions because it's implement the same interface. Then after that, in my when I want to use that, one of the way that we can use that is we can just inject that token in, and then in this case, and because of Angular dependency injection, we put the we specify that this is a multi-provider. What it will return us is an array of all the service that's available, all the things that we. So there's in this case there's 2, so we inject 2 service in. Then after that, I can just loop through this processor and then find like what are the. So I have, for example, if I want to loop these 2, I have a list of A and X. So it's chart A and chart X. In this case, I can just loop through the providers and then just find it and call the process data method. And then what you can see here is, so it's something like you have a standard interface, but you have a multiple, probably you have 2 or 3 different implementation. You can just use the multi-provider.
Jecelyn, I love this example. It's awesome. It really showcases how the multi works, but also the concept of now how easy it is to kind of scaffold an application and say we're going to. The chart is a great example of this, of saying one way to show data or another, and you can kind of build that out in an elegant manner in your code and simply provide those different implementations of that interface of how it displays that data. And wire that all up within Angular. It's killer. I love it.
Yeah, we also use this for some of our grid, because in some of our application we have a lot of tables, we have a lot of grid that we need to show out, and all the grid basically pretty much you have column definitions that. So each of the table, so we can have a multi-providers of different grids, and then each of the grid you will have a process column definitions function, which you can dump in just anything that you want to dump in with just same method, but then you can just call that. So it's very easy. So wherever you create the same thing, you have a same way of doing that. You just need to implement a certain method and then just pass in as a multi-provider.
And as part of that, you could hook into different properties on that component to be able to share, or for the user to select what type of chart processor they want, not just to iterate through and show both, but to allow the user to select, hey, this is how I want to see the data presented in the way that it makes the most sense for me. I really like that implementation, that use case.
Yeah. And another good, so apart from this, some of the project, so because of we have some of the, we have a base service which always need to inject some service. So for example, like a title service, which so for some of the container components, we always need to show, we always need to set title, we always need to set some authentications. In this case, the Angular injector. So because for the base component, we don't want to see, we don't want to have the constructor to inject all the service in. So what we do is we call the injector and just use the injector.get to get a certain service to initialize that. Then in the child component, then we just use that.
As it brings up a good question, like how often do you use, or your team or other people, anybody find themselves using the injector to look up services? Is it kind of like not really done that much, or is there occasions where we need to kind of do that?
In my project, we only just use that for some base services, for some base setup. We don't, because it's like this thing, when you use injector, right, it's like embedded in your code. You cannot really see that. So we only use that for a specific use case, and it's not a widely used pattern that we are using.
One thing that you can use that manually using the injector for is if you have like circular dependencies, but they're circular at initialization, but at runtime, they're not circular. So think of something like an error handler, right? You can't inject like a service, right, into an error handler because it could be circular. But at the time of the error, it's not circular. So a lot of times I have like global error handlers and I can inject whatever I want in the constructor, but then when the error actually happens, the error handler is already initialized, and then I can use the injector to get that instance at that time. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like that's something that's like that you hit with dependency injection, right? Whether it's here in Angular or here in another language, C# or whatnot, and it's one of those, how do you solve that scenario? And you service locator or something like that, right? Cool. So there was a time when we were able to inject or provide services at the component level, the component decorator level. And I don't know, do everybody remember that? And how do you feel about that? And
you can still do that.
Yeah, I don't think it's been removed.
Yeah, you can. There's specific cases for that. There's like specific use cases for that.
So what would you feel is the use case, the benefit for doing it at that level?
I as somebody who's used it, my use case was I had a complex component that I was using I wanted to use a service per instance of the component to do a lot of processing and extract that logic into a service versus leaving in the component. And I was using state within that service, right or wrong, I was. And it made sense to create a new instance for every time that component was created.
Yeah.
So basically this little symbiotic buddy class that helped my component out by managing and holding on to that data and doing a lot of the processing.
Yeah, let's say
making it more testable too.
Let's say that you have like a component and it's got like a tree of nested components in it. and you have a state service, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. You have a state service, and you want that state service to be specific, instantiated for each top level component, but not shared across the global set. So that's a good use case for the providers at the component level.
Yeah, I also use that normally use that for parents component, and then serve at a state service like Austin say. But then after that, when we move to some state service like ngXS or ngIS, we just remove that because the state manage that. But if you don't use like state management library, then it makes sense that because that's a particular service, you don't need it like for all the others component. You just need for this particular parents component and the child. So that makes sense if you inject it to the component service.
So one of the things that I always kind of got a little concerned about with it was when I'm writing a unit test for that component, if I'm instantiating that component, I can easily inject a mock or something into that, thing, because I'm controlling the instantiation, right? But if I was to use the test bed and test fixture pattern, right, does it become difficult to then say I want to mock out that service? Well, how do I mock that out when the component is the one providing it, right? I mean, I guess I could spy on it, so I could do it that way. I guess maybe that's the solution. But it feels to me from a unit test standpoint that like I really want to be able to provide a different thing for that. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Well, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
If I remember correctly, even though you're providing it in the constructors, or excuse me, the components metadata, you still need to supply it as a constructor parameter. So you still have full control to be able to mock that out. So it's not a matter of a difference of the use case inside of the class. It's a matter of setting up a separate injector provider at the component level. So the use case, I mean, the testability of it doesn't change at all.
Cool. I feel better.
It's a digital hug for you, buddy. Inject that class in or that service in and use it how you want.
Nice. All right. I have confidence.
He's going to do this everywhere now. Now that we told him he can do this, it's going to be his new thing.
Well, I seem to recall, and days go by really fast now, so I'm not sure, right? Life goes flying fast. But I seem to recall a time early on with Angular where that was where we were providing our all of our services were at the component metadata.
Yeah, and I wish it still was that way.
All right. So do we know anything about maybe some future stuff that's coming with whole dependency injection and stuff like that, like treeshakable stuff? Maybe there's been some chatter about that with Angular 6, and I don't know, anybody know a little bit about that stuff?
Yeah, I just read. So I just read and watch some videos. So in Angular, not Angular 6, but in the futures Angular 7 or onwards, probably not 7. 6. Okay, so you can, yeah, you can don't need to. The module concept probably will be gone, and what you can do is there's one pretty good articles that mention about the treeshakable doctrine, which you during your injectable, so you have a decorator called injectable, and from there you can mention like where do you want to inject this service to, like which module do you want to inject it to. Then you don't need to specify that in ng module. So there's something like that. So it would be the way moving forward, I guess.
Yeah, that as far as I know, that's in 6. Not just core, but it'll be in the CLI as well. So whenever you generate a service, it'll give you what's called a treeshakable service by default. So you mentioned, I think it's the injection or injectable decorator has a property on it called provided in that tells you where that service is going to be provided. I think the default for that is the string root, which is the root injector, or you can specify a module of where that would be injected.
And you can do that in the components too. I think. I'm wrong.
I'm not aware of that, but maybe.
I'm
There's
not sure.
something like that for the components that you can do. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was thinking of what you were just describing. I'm going crazy.
Well, the future knows, right? So we'll see in the future. But it's pretty cool that we got some new stuff potentially coming along. So the dependency injection story is still moving along and going forward. All right, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Is there anything else that we want to mention about dependency injection before we kind of get to picks and wrap things up? Anybody? Or are we ready to close the chapter on dependency injection?
I got nothing.
No.
All right. All right, well, let's do some picks if anybody has any picks today. Austin, do you have anything you want to share?
No picks for me today.
You sure?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to pick our previous episode a couple episodes ago? You can do that. I can pick that. I can pick the NGXS episode and Austin's state management. So, Mike, do you have anything?
Just one. I've missed a few episodes of recent, but it was because I was working hard to get an RC release of the Angular CLI, which came out this morning, yesterday. I don't know, days, hours, time. Kind of confusing. But the first RC is out, so RC0 of the CLI is released. So looking forward to tweaking that during the RC period for a final release.
Nice. All right, I got a pick. And it's this lens, this mobile lens from Moment Gear. They make video lenses and things like that for phones. And they've got one that's under a Kickstarter right now that's an anamorphic widescreen lens. So it's pretty cool. So I might have to order up one of those things. But it basically clips onto your phone and will do anamorphic aspect ratio, which is really, really wide, like you see in the cinema. And it also has this other thing that adds like these lens flares to it. So you also get these, anytime it hits light, you see these lines and stuff like that. So it's very cinematic, but I don't know if you can turn that off or not. I don't know if I want like J.J. Abrams with everything that I record. But I do want the anamorphic widescreen format. So I don't know. We'll see. But that's my pick. Moment anamorphic lens. Seems pretty cool. All right, Jecelyn, do you have anything that you want to pick?
Okay, just one. So check out NGXS. Yeah, so because I think it's a pretty good document, pretty well documented, and I'm checking that out as well. Try to implement that. Try to use that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Austin's getting all kinds of plugs today. All right, Jecelyn, do you do any talks anywhere? Do you have any blog posts or anything else that you want to share? Maybe places that people can follow you on, that sort of thing?
I have a blog. So I wrote in Scotch.io. So it's one of the websites that posts a lot of web development articles. So you can find me there. And I have a Medium account as well, which I post my articles regularly.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, taking the time to share with us, talk about dependency injection and share your knowledge. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. All right. That's it. That's a wrap. We'll call it good for today, and we will see everybody next week. We got ngConf coming up pretty soon. We're going to do a live episode from ngConf on a Friday during lunch, so that should be crazy. But I think we got one more episode before then. So we'll see you next week. Later.